The crack in the rock wall was barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. Beyond it, hidden from every road and every eye, sat a cabin that had waited 30 years for someone to come home. Jonah Vale pressed his lantern through the gap and went still. Behind him, his daughters held their breath. 3 weeks earlier, Jonah Vale had owned nothing but a wagon, a toolbox, and a family he loved more than sense. That had seemed like enough. But standing in the landlord's doorway on a cold April morning, listening to numbers that no working man could meet, he understood something for the first time. A man who owns no ground stands on someone else's mercy. That was a thin place to build a life. Timber Hollow had grown faster than anyone expected. 2 years ago, it had been a scattering of tents and a single dry goods counter. Now it had a mill, a post office, a church frame going up on the eastern rise, and 4 streets of proper buildings with glass in the windows. The rent had grown with it. Jonah worked timber. He was broad through the chest and steady with an axe, the kind of man foremen liked because he showed up before the bell and never needed to be told a thing twice. He brought home enough to cover what the family needed, most months. But the rooms they rented on Birch Street had never been more than a temporary arrangement. 2 low-ceilinged rooms above a feed merchant's storage, drafty in winter, sweltering by July, and shared with the smell of grain dust and mice. Still, it was a roof. It was theirs, until it wasn't. Maren made it into something. She had a gift for that, for taking whatever was plain and making it feel cared for. She hung a square of blue cloth over the window facing the alley. She kept a tin cup of dried wildflowers on the shelf above the stove. When the girls were sick with colds in February, she stayed up 2 nights running and came out of it without complaint, her pale hair pinned back and her hands smelling of eucalyptus and warm broth. Elsie and June were 6 years old and identical in every visible way. The same bright blonde hair, the same gap in their front teeth, the same habit of reaching for each other's hand when something startled them. The only reliable difference was that Elsie asked questions constantly and June mostly listened, storing things up behind her dark eyes to think about later. They had made a life in those 2 rented rooms. Not a large life, not a comfortable one by any measure, but a real one, full of small routines and small joys, and the ordinary warmth of 4 people who knew each other down to the grain. Then the letter came from the landlord. The rent was going up by 1/3, effective the 1st of May. The landlord had written it in careful, apologetic language, but the numbers were plain. Jonah read it twice, standing at the foot of the stairs, then folded it and put it in his coat pocket, and went to work. He told Maren that evening after the girls were asleep. She sat with her hands folded on the table and listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said, "We'll find something." But they didn't. 3 weeks of looking turned up nothing in Timber Hollow that a man earning timber wages could afford with 2 small children in tow. By the last day of April, they had no plan and no place to go. They packed what they owned into the wagon. It did not take long. The blue cloth came down from the window. The tin cup of dried flowers was wrapped in newspaper and tucked into the side of a crate. The girls each carried their own small bundle, a blanket, a wooden toy, a pair of extra stockings, and sat in the wagon bed without being told to, because children understand when seriousness is required of them. Jonah stood on the Birch Street curb with his hat in his hands and tried to think. He had spoken with 2 other landlords in Timber Hollow, and both had turned the family away, not rudely, but firmly. A family with young children was a liability, one man said, using the word as though it were simply a fact of arithmetic. Another property was already spoken for. A third was above a saloon, and no place for girls. He had considered the mining camp west of town, But Maren had looked at him when he mentioned it in a way that required no words. He had considered moving on entirely, heading south toward Pueblo, or east toward the flatter land where things were cheaper. But moving meant spending what little they had saved, arriving somewhere new with empty pockets and no contacts, starting over in a place that owed them nothing. He was standing in that particular gray space between decisions, the kind where every door seems equally closed, when the post rider came down the street. The envelope was addressed in a law clerk's hand, with a return address from a small office in Glenwood Springs. The letter inside was brief. A man named Silas Rowan had died in March, the clerk wrote, with no living children or named heirs closer than a third cousin twice removed, which was Jonah, a connection through his mother's side that he had barely known existed. Silas Rowan had left a deed. The property was described as 37 acres on the eastern slope of Black Fern Pass, bounded by stone and timber, with one structure of uncertain condition. The clerk noted, with what seemed like professional sympathy, that the land had not been assessed in over a decade and was not considered of significant value. Jonah read it twice. Then he read it aloud to Maren. She looked up at the mountains. They left Timber Hollow before noon. The wagon was loaded. The girls were settled in the back with the crate and the bundled blankets. Maren sat straight beside Jonah on the bench, her hands in her lap, her face turned toward the high country. The sky had gone gray and soft, the way it does in late April when rain is deciding whether to fall. Jonah shook the reins. The horse moved forward. He had no idea what they were heading toward. He had a deed in his coat pocket and 37 acres of mountain land that a lawyer had described as being of no particular value. It was, at that moment, the whole of what they owned. There was a second envelope tucked inside the legal letter, smaller, unsealed, written in a different hand. Jonah had not noticed it until Maren found it wedged in the fold. She smoothed it open carefully. It was a single page, written in a slow, deliberate hand. To whoever finds this land worth finding, it began. I built the place for reasons that seemed good at the time. I leave it to someone young enough to use it, and stubborn enough to look past what first appears. S. Rowan. The road to Black Fern Pass was not much of a road. It had been, once. The rutted evidence of wagon traffic was still visible in places beneath the pine needle mulch and spring mud. But no one had kept it up in years, and the mountain had been quietly taking it back. Jonah drove slowly, leaning forward on the bench as if an extra inch of height would help him see around the next bend. The girls in the back had stopped asking where they were going and were watching the trees instead, which had grown taller and older and farther apart as the altitude climbed. The rain came not long after they left the last visible farmstead behind. It was not a heavy rain, just a cold, patient drizzle that silvered the pine branches and made the rock outcroppings along the road shine like dull pewter. Maren pulled a canvas tarp across the open back of the wagon to keep the crates dry. June pressed close to her side. Elsie stuck her hand out to catch raindrops until Maren gently drew it back in. By mid-afternoon, they had climbed high enough that the air tasted different, cleaner, and colder, with a mineral edge that came off the stone. The pass was visible now as a notch in the ridge above them, two dark peaks leaning together like a cathedral arch. The deed described a trail marker, a post with a notch cut into the south face, and Jonah found it half hidden by a young alder that had grown up beside it. He turned the wagon off the road onto what was barely a track, two faint lines in the ground running toward a wall of dark rock and dense spruce. "This is it?" Elsie said, from behind him. "This is the land," Jonah said. "I don't know yet what's on it. He brought the wagon to a stop at the base of a wide rock face that rose perhaps 30 feet before it gave way to a jumble of spruce and boulder. The rain tapped quietly on the canvas. The horse stood patient and unimpressed. Jonah climbed down and walked the base of the cliff, reading the ground the way a man learns to read ground after years of working in the timber, watching for changes in the plant life, in the moisture, in the way the stone had worn. Moss grew thick here, greener than anywhere they had passed, which meant water and shelter. Wild ferns pushed up between the rocks in dense bundles. Something about the stone felt deliberate, too flat across the base, too even, in the way that a thing shaped by human hands often reads differently from a thing shaped by time alone. He found the crack about 40 feet from where he'd started. It was vertical, perhaps 2 feet wide at the base, and narrowing as it rose, half hidden by a dark curtain of hanging fern and the shadow of an overhang above. He would have missed it entirely in dry weather. The rain had made the stone around it glisten, and the fern hang heavier, which somehow made the dark space behind it more visible rather than less. He pushed the fern aside. Cold air moved against his face, not the damp cold of exposed mountain air, but a still, enclosed cold that smelled of old wood and dry earth and something faintly like pine smoke from another age. He fetched the lantern from the wagon box, lit it, and came back. "What is it?" Maren called from the wagon. "I don't know yet," he said. "Stay with the girls." He turned sideways and eased through the gap. The rock pressed against his chest and back at the same time. It was just barely wide enough, and then it released him into open air. He held the lantern up. The space on the other side was roughly 20 feet across, sheltered on 3 sides by the cliff face, open above to a narrow strip of dark sky. And there, built into the rock wall itself, as though the mountain had grown it, was a cabin. He stood still for a long moment, long enough that Maren called his name through the rock. He pressed back through the crack and found her standing at the wagon with June on her hip and Elsie beside her, both girls watching him with wide, careful eyes. "Bring the girls," he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. "You'll want to see this." He guided them through one at a time. Elsie first, then June, then Maren, who had to turn sideways and breathe in and press through with her eyes ahead, not looking at the stone on either side. He held the lantern on the far side so they could see where to step. When Maren came through and straightened and looked up, she put both hands over her mouth. The cabin was low and wide, built from split logs the color of dark honey, with a roof that sloped gently back against the cliff face and was covered entirely in deep green moss. The overhang of rock above it formed a natural porch, dry and swept clean by decades of wind running along the cliff. The walls were solid, no visible rot, no leaning. The door was latched shut and held by a length of leather cord looped over a wooden peg. Jonah lifted the cord. The door swung open without protest, as though it had been kept oiled. The smell that came out was dry and still and very old, beeswax and wood ash and the faint sweetness of dried herbs tied in bunches from the ceiling. He lifted the lantern inside. One room, a stone hearth along the back wall, wide enough to cook in, with iron hooks still hanging in place above the firebox, a rough pine table with 2 benches, 2 wooden bunks built into the left wall, frame and all, with the rope webbing still strung between the frames, tight and even. Shelves along the right wall, holding a row of sealed tin canisters, a folded piece of oilcloth, 3 candles, a hand axe, a ball of hemp cord, and a tin lantern. A small shuttered window cut into the front wall, its shutter hanging closed, but hinged and intact. Elsie walked in and turned around slowly in the center of the room, looking at everything with the systematic seriousness of a child who is trying to understand something large. "Someone lived here," she said. "Yes," Maren said. "A long time ago." "Is he gone?" "He is," Jonah said. "He left it to us." June had gone to the hearth. She crouched in front of it and looked up into the flue, and then looked back at her father with an expression of profound satisfaction. "It has a chimney," she announced, as though this settled a question that had been troubling her. Maren laughed, a real laugh, sudden and clear and surprised. It bounced off the stone walls and filled the room. The next 2 hours were movement and discovery. Jonah found a woodpile against the rock wall outside, under the overhang. 20 years of careful stacking, but the lower layers were still solid and dry beneath the weathered outer rounds. He split kindling while Maren swept the cabin floor with a branch of dry fern. They opened the tin canisters and found cornmeal, dried beans, salt, and a paper packet of pepper, all sealed with wax and still good. The girls carried small armloads of firewood through the crack in the wall with great ceremony, passing the pieces back and forth to each other with the gravity of important work. By the time full dark came down the pass, the hearth was lit. The chimney drew cleanly, a small miracle, and the warm light reached every corner of the single room. The blankets from the wagon were spread on the bunk frames. Maren warmed the dried beans in the iron pot and added salt and a broken piece of dried cornbread from the crate, and the four of them ate together at the pine table with the lantern burning between them. Outside, the rain continued. In here, it could not reach them. After supper, Jonah took the deed from his coat pocket and unfolded it on the table. He smoothed it flat with his hand and read it again in the firelight. 37 acres, his name on the document, the land surveyor's marks along the margin in faded ink. He had never owned anything that could not be loaded in a wagon. He folded the deed carefully and set it on the shelf beside the 3 candles. Maren watched him do it without speaking. Then she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and he turned his hand over and held on. This land was theirs, wholly and entirely. No one could raise the rent. The first week was harder than that first evening had made it seem. The cabin was sound, but it had not been lived in for 30 years, and the mountain had a long memory. The moss on the roof was beautiful from below, but the layer beneath it was thin in places, and when the rain returned on the 3rd day, a real rain this time, steady and cold, Jonah found 3 separate places where water was working through the roof and darkening the interior wall logs. None of them were serious yet. All of them would become serious if left alone. He spent 2 full days on the roof with a bundle of moss cut from the rock face below, packing the thin spots and pressing the layers back together with his hands, working in short stretches while the rain moved through in waves. Maren passed material up to him through the window and kept the girls occupied inside. June developed a persistent cough from the damp air, the kind that sounds worse than it is, but keeps a mother awake regardless. Maren made a steam tent from the pot and a piece of canvas and sat with her daughter through 2 evenings of it, singing in a low voice until the coughing settled. The horse had to be stabled somewhere. The sheltered space outside the crack was too exposed in a driving rain and too narrow for the animal to move comfortably. Jonah scouted the land immediately east of the rock face and found a natural shelf of ground backed by a low cliff, deep enough to provide some protection, and spent 3 days building a lean-to shelter from the timber he felled from the ridge above. It was rough work, and the logs were green and heavy, and by the 2nd night, his hands had new blisters over old calluses, and his back made itself known whenever he bent. Maren took stock of their food supply and did the arithmetic honestly. What they had brought and what was in the tins would carry them through perhaps 2.5 weeks at careful rationing. After that, someone would need to go to Timber Hollow for provisions. That meant a half-day ride each way, and it meant spending money they did not yet have a plan to replace. Jonah sat with that problem for a full evening, turning it over quietly the way he turned difficult things. The land was theirs, but it produced nothing yet. He could not work timber up here. The nearest operation was too far, and leaving Maren and the girls alone for a full workday was not something he was willing to do until the place was better established. There was no ready cash coming. He found the answer in the woodpile. Mixed in with the regular firewood rounds, stacked carefully in the back corner of the pile under the overhang, were 15 cords of clean split fir, all of it dry, all of it good. Not the ordinary scrap wood of a man who heated his own hearth. This was milled length uniform, the kind of wood that a settlement with a growing mill would pay honest money for. Silas Rowan had been a practical man. Jonah spent 2 days loading the wagon with as much as it would carry, making the trip down to Timber Hollow, and returning with flour, lard, dried fruit, 2 new candles, a length of oilcloth for the window, and enough coin left over to feel like a margin rather than a crisis. The feed merchant at the bottom of Birch Street, the same one whose storage had smelled of grain dust and mice for 2 years, loaded his own cart with what Jonah left behind. Jonah did not linger on that. He pointed the horse back up the mountain. The second difficulty was lonelier than the first. Maren had not said anything about it directly, but Jonah saw it the way a person sees a thing they have been watching without knowing they were watching. She was fine in the mornings, fine when she had work to do. Cleaning, cooking, organizing the shelf, teaching the girls their letters at the pine table with a stick of charcoal and a flat piece of bark. But in the quiet of late afternoon, when the light through the narrow shuttered window went gray and the mountains pressed close on every side, she would grow still in a way that was different from her usual stillness. He asked her on the 9th night, after the girls were in their bunks. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "I don't miss Timber Hollow exactly," she said. "I miss the sound of neighbors. I miss knowing that someone is near." Jonah understood. The cabin was hidden. That was partly its virtue. But virtue and loneliness can come from the same source, and what sheltered them from the world also sealed the world away. He thought about it the following days while he worked, finishing the lean-to, hauling water from the spring he'd found a 1/4 mile up the slope, cutting a drainage channel along the base of the cliff to direct the roof runoff away from the foundation. He had no solution to offer. He could not conjure neighbors from mountain air. What came instead was smaller and better. On the 12th day, while Jonah was away at the spring and Maren was inside, a woman appeared at the foot of the track, a neighbor from a homestead 3 miles east, following a wandering milk cow that had climbed higher than expected. The woman's name was Ruth Hadley, and she was perhaps 40, broad-shouldered, direct in the way of people who have lived alone enough to have stopped prefacing things. She found Maren standing outside the rock face with a bucket and looked at her with the frank curiosity of someone who had not expected to find another woman at this elevation. They talked for nearly an hour. Ruth Hadley knew of Silas Rowan, had traded with him once or twice years ago before he stopped coming down. She had not known anyone was living here now. When she finally retrieved her cow from the fern bank where it had settled, she paused and said, in the same direct way, "I'll come by Thursday. I put up apple preserves last fall and there's more than one woman can use." She did. She came Thursday with the preserves and a wedge of hard cheese, and stayed long enough to sit at the pine table and tell Maren the names of every family within a morning's ride, who had children, who kept chickens, who would trade labor for labor and not think the worse of you for needing it. The girls sat on their bunk and listened with shining eyes. When Ruth Hadley left, the mountain did not feel quite so sealed. Maren stood outside the crack in the wall and watched her go down the track, then turned back to look at the cabin tucked into its hillside, the moss-covered roof, the steady curl of smoke from the chimney, the ferns growing thick and green at the base of the rock. "Jonah," she called. He looked up from the drainage ditch. "I think I'd like to plant something," she said. "Along the south face. There's good light there in the morning." He set down his spade. "Tell me where." It was the wagon axle that broke the following week, not dramatically, not with any warning, but with a slow, wooden groan on the morning Jonah needed it most to haul the last of Silas's cordwood down to Timber Hollow before the mill's buyer left for his quarterly run south. Without that sale, the small margin of coin on the shelf would not stretch through June, and June was only 2 weeks away. He stood beside the wagon in the gray morning light and looked at the snapped wood for a long time. The girls were still asleep. Maren had not yet come out. He was, at that moment, entirely alone with the problem. He sat on the wagon's running board for a while and let the weight of it settle. This was the feeling he'd carried since Birch Street. Since before Birch Street, if he was honest, the feeling of working hard enough and still arriving at the edge of something unmanageable. He had believed on the night they lit the hearth for the first time that the cabin changed that, and it had changed some of it. The deep uncertainty of having no place, the month-to-month precariousness that had followed him for years, that was gone. The land was his. No one would take it. But the land did not answer every problem. He still had to feed his family. He still had to make the margin hold. And he was sitting next to a broken axle on a cold morning with no way to get down the mountain in time. He thought about Silas Rowan, who had built a cabin inside a mountain and stocked a woodpile meant for someone else, and written a letter addressed to no one in particular. A man who had figured out how to live on a difficult piece of land for 30 years alone. Jonah looked up the slope toward the tree line. There was always something that could be done. You found the next piece, and you worked with what you had. He stood up and went to the tool shelf. The repair was not elegant. He split a sound piece of the remaining fir to the right dimension, shaped it with the hand axe and the draw knife he'd found hanging on the cabin wall, and fitted it to the axle housing with the iron banding he'd been saving in the wagon box for exactly the kind of emergency that eventually arrives. It took most of the morning. By midday, the wagon rolled. Maren handed him a piece of cornbread when he finished. She had watched the whole thing without saying a word, which was its own form of confidence. He made the sale by an hour. The mill buyer, a square-built man named Garrett, who wore the same expression, whether he was pleased or not, walked the length of the stacked wood, pressed his thumb into 3 or 4 pieces, and named a price. Jonah named a slightly higher one. They settled in the middle. Garrett counted the coin into his hand without ceremony and moved on to the next transaction, and Jonah stood in the mill yard with more money than he'd had at one time in 2 years. He bought what the family needed: proper flour in a sealed sack, a tin of dried apples, a wedge of cured pork, a new candle supply, and a small glass bottle of liniment for his hands that Maren had not asked for, but would not refuse. He also bought, after a moment's thought, a small packet of flower seeds from the dry goods counter. The woman behind the counter told him they were mountain hardy varieties, columbine and blue flax, and something she called alpine forget-me-not. He tucked them in his coat pocket next to the repaired axle receipt and drove home. The wagon climbed the familiar track in the late afternoon light, and Jonah noticed, not for the first time, how differently the place looked when you were arriving rather than leaving. From below, the cabin was invisible. There was only the rock face and the dark spruce and the curtain of fern over the crack in the wall. It looked, to any passing eye, like nothing, like a dead end, like a place a man would turn around from. He knew better now. He called through the rock before he came through, so as not to startle the girls. Elsie's voice came back immediately. She had been watching for him, apparently, from her position on top of a flat boulder she had claimed as her observation post. June appeared through the crack a moment later and took the packet of dried apples from his hands and carried it inside with great seriousness. Maren was at the south face of the rock wall when he finished unharnessing the horse. She had turned the soil along a 15-foot strip where the morning light hit longest, working it with the short-handled spade and mixing in the dark leaf mold she'd been collecting in a tin pail from the base of the ferns. She had her sleeves rolled and her hair back and the look she wore when a thing was going exactly as she intended. He gave her the flower seeds without preamble. She looked at the packet, read the names, and then looked at him in the way that meant more than whatever she was about to say. "They'll come up next spring," she said. "That's all right," he said. "We'll be here." She smiled at that, not the polite, managing smile of a woman holding things together, but a real one, the kind that reached her eyes and stayed. They planted the kitchen seeds that evening as a family, the beans and the early lettuces and a row of turnips along the south strip, the girls kneeling in the turned soil and pressing seeds in with their thumbs, June measuring the spacing with absolute precision, and Elsie providing commentary on the quality of each hole. Maren called the rows straight, which they were not entirely, but they were planted with care. And that was what mattered. Jonah washed his hands at the spring bucket and stood for a moment outside the crack in the wall, looking up at the ridge above. The sky had gone that deep early summer blue that comes at altitude after a clear day, the kind of blue that looks painted on. The spruce on the ridge were still and dark. Somewhere above the tree line, a single bird was calling, unhurried and clear. He thought about what it meant to own a piece of ground. Not in the legal sense. He understood that part. He meant it in the other sense. The way a place becomes yours, not when you sign a document, but when you have worried about its roof in the rain, and dug its drainage, and split its wood, and planted things in its soil that you intend to harvest. The way a place holds your effort and gives it back to you in the form of shelter and warmth and the sight of your daughter's hands pressing seeds into the earth. Silas Rowan had understood something. He had built a hidden thing and kept it intact, and then left it to a stranger he'd chosen on the basis of blood and the hope that someone young enough and stubborn enough would find it worth finding. That was an act of faith in a direction Jonah had not previously thought to look for it. He went back inside. The hearth was lit. The iron pot was on the hook with the cured pork and dried apples, making the small room smell of warmth and food. The girls had taken their places at the pine table, Elsie explaining something to June at length, and June listening with patient skepticism. Maren was at the shelf, arranging the new supplies with the careful deliberateness she gave to every ordering of space, every small act of making a place into a home. Jonah hung his coat on the wooden peg beside the door, the same peg that had held Silas Rowan's coat for 30 years before it held his, and sat down at the table. Papa, Elsie said, without looking up from whatever she was drawing on her piece of bark. When the flowers come up, can we show Mrs. Hadley? We can, he said. Good, she said. I think she'd like blue ones best. He looked across the table at Maren. She was smiling again, quietly, her back to him, putting things in order. 6 weeks after the night they had nowhere to go, a lamp burned in the window of a hidden cabin on the eastern slope of Black Fern Pass. From outside, from the track, from the road below, from any angle a passing stranger might approach, there was nothing to see. Only rock and rain-washed stone and old spruce and the patient green of fern. But inside, behind 30 feet of solid mountain, a family sat down to supper on their own land, under their own roof, and the fire gave back everything the day had taken. The twin girls reached for each other's hands across the table and held on.